Section 7 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 6, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This recording is in the public domain. Elisabeth, Chapter 3, Part 1. It was on the 18th of March that Elisabeth was lodged in the Tower, and she was soon afterwards subjected to a rigorous examination by the Lord Chancellor Gardiner, with 9 other of the Lords of the Council. They questioned her on her motives for her projected remove to Donnington Castle during the late insurrection. Elisabeth, being taken by surprise, allowed her natural propensity for dissimulation to betray her into the childish evocation of affecting to be unconscious that she had such a house as Donnington. When Sir James Crofts was brought in and confronted with her, she recollected herself and said, "As touching my remove to Donnington, my officers and you, Sir James Crofts, being then present, can well testify whether any rash or unbeseeming word did then pass my lips, which might not have well become a faithful and loyal subject." Thus adjured, Sir James Crofts knelt to her and said, "He was heartily sorry to be brought in that day to be a witness against her grace, but he took God to record that he never knew anything of her worthy the least suspicion." "My lords," said Elisabeth, "methinks you do me wrong to examine every mean prisoner against me. If they have done evil, let them answer for it. I pray you, join me not with such offenders. Touching my remove from Ashridge to Donnington, I do remember me that Mr. Hoby, mine officers, and you, Sir James Crofts, had some talk about it. But what is that to the purpose? Might I not, my lords, go to mine own houses at all times?" Whereupon the Lord of Arundel, kneeling down, observed, "that her grace said the truth, and that himself was sorry to see her troubled about such vain matters." "Well, my lords," rejoined she, "you sift me narrowly, but you can do no more than God hath appointed, unto whom I pray to forgive you all." This generous burst of feeling on the part of the Earl of Arundel must have had a startling effect on all present, for he had been foremost in the death cry against Elisabeth, and had urged the queen to bring her to trial and execution. Blinded by the malignant excitement of party feeling, he had, doubtless, so far deceived himself as to regard such a measure as a stern duty to the nation at large, in order to prevent future insurrections, by sacrificing one person for the security of Mary's government. But when he saw in her the young defenceless woman whom he and his colleagues had visited in her lonely prison room, to browbeat and to entangle in her talk, his heart smote him for the cruel part he had taken, and he yielded to the generous impulse which prompted him to express his conviction of her innocence and his remorse for the injurious treatment to which she was subjected. So powerful was the reaction of his feelings on this occasion, that he not only laboured as strenuously for the preservation of Elisabeth as he had hitherto done for her destruction, but even went so far as to offer his heir to her for a husband, and subsequently made her a tender of his own hand, and became one of the most persevering of her wooers. It is to be feared that Elisabeth, then in the bloom of youth, and very fairly endowed by nature, exerted all her fascinations to entangle the heart of this stern pillar of her sister's throne in the perplexities of a delusive passion for herself. That the royal coquette indulged the stately old earl with deceitful hopes appears evident by the tone he assumed towards her after her accession to the throne, and his jealousy of his handsome, audacious rival, Robert Dudley. But of this hereafter. Elisabeth's confinement in the Tower was, at first, so rigorous that she was not permitted to see any one but the servants who had been selected by the council to wait upon her, a service fraught with danger even to those who were permitted to perform it. As for the other members of her household, several were in prison, and one of these, Edmund Tremaine, was subjected to the infliction of torture in the vain attempt to extort evidence against her. Before Elisabeth had been 2 days in the Tower, the use of English prayers and Protestant rites was prohibited, and she was required to hear mass. One of her ladies, Mrs. Elisabeth Sands, refused to attend that service. on which her father brought Abbot Feckenham to persuade her to it, but as she continued firm in her resistance, she was dismissed from her office, and another lady, Mrs. Coldburn, appointed in her stead. Another of Elizabeth's ladies, the beautiful Isabella Markham, who was just married to Sir John Harrington, was also sequestered from her service, on account of her heretical opinions, and committed to a prison lodging in the Tower, with her husband, whose offence was having conveyed a letter to the princess. This misdemeanour, however, appears to have been committed as far back as the second year of Edward VI., if we may judge from the allusions Harrington makes to his former master, the Lord Admiral Thomas Seymour, in the spirited letter of remonstrance which he addressed to Gardiner, on the subject of his imprisonment and that of his wife. Nothing can afford a more beautiful picture of the attachment subsisting between the captive princess and these faithful adherents than this letter, which is written in the fearless spirit of a true knight and noble-minded gentleman. My lord, this mine humble prayer doth come with much sorrow, for any deed of evil that have been done to your lordship, but alas, I know of none, save such duty to the Lady Elisabeth as I am bounden to pay her at all times. And if this matter breedeth in you such wrath towards her and me, I shall not, in this mine imprisonment, repent thereof. My wife is her servant, and doth but rejoice in this our misery, when we look with whom we are holden in bondage. Our gracious King Henry did ever advance our family's good estate, as did his pious father aforetime. Wherefore our service is in remembrance of such good kindness, albeit there needeth none other cause to render our tendance, sith the Lady Elisabeth beareth such piety and godly affection to all virtue. Consider that your lordship aforetime hath combated with much like affliction. Why then should not our state cause you to recount the same, and breed pity to usward? Mine poor lady hath greater cause to wail than we of such small degree, but her rare example affordeth comfort to us, and shameth our complaint. Why then, my lord, must I be thus annoyed for one deed of special goodwill to the Lady Elisabeth, in bearing a letter sent from one that had such right to give me his commands, and to one who had such right to all mine hearty service? May God incline you to amend all this cruelty, and ever and anon turn our prayer in good and merciful consideration. My Lord Admiral Seymour did truly win my love amidst this hard and deadly annoyance. Now may the same like pity touch your heart, and deal us better usage. His service was ever joyful, and why must this be afflicting? Mine ancient kindred have ever held their duty and liege obeisance, nor will I do them such dishonor as may blot out their worthy deeds, but will ever abide in all honesty and love. If you should give ear to my complaint, it will bind me to thankfully repay this kindness, but if not, we will continue to suffer, and rest ourselves in God, whose mercy is sure and safe, and all true love to her, the Princess Elisabeth, who doth honour us in tender sort, and scorneth not to shed her tears with ours. I commend your lordship to God's appointment, and rest sorely afflicted, John Harrington. From the Tower, 1554. The above interesting letter is the more valuable because it affords the testimony of the accomplished writer as to the personal deportment of Elisabeth among her own immediate friends during their mutual imprisonment in the Tower. Sir John Harrington the younger says, that his parents had not any comfort to beguile their affliction but the sweet words and sweeter deeds of their mistress and fellow prisoner, the Princess Elisabeth. In after years Elisabeth herself told Castelnau, the French ambassador, when adverting to this period, that she was in great danger of losing her life from the displeasure her sister had conceived against her, in consequence of the accusations that were fabricated on the subject of her correspondence with the King of France, and having no hope of escaping, she desired to make her sister only one request, which was, that she might have her head cut off with a sword, as in France, and not with an axe, after the present fashion adopted in England, and therefore desired that an executioner might be sent for out of France, if it were so determined. What frightful visions, connected with the last act of her unfortunate mother's tragedy, must have haunted the prison musings of the royal captive! who having recently recovered from a long and severe malady, was probably suffering from physical depression of spirits at this time. The traditions of the Tower of London affirm that the lodging of the Princess Elizabeth was immediately under the great alarm bell, which in case of any attempt being made for her escape, was to have raised its clamorous tocsin to summon assistance and the hue and cry for pursuit. It seems scarcely probable, however, that she had been placed in such close contiguity with Courtenay, unless the proximity were artfully contrived as a snare to lure them into a stolen intercourse, or attempts at correspondence, for the purpose of furnishing a fresh mass of evidence against them. In a letter of the 3rd of April, Renaud relates the particulars of 2 successive interviews, which he had had with the queen and some of the members of her council, on the measures necessary to be adopted for the security of Don Philip's person, before he would venture himself in England. His Excellency states, that he had assured the queen that it was of the utmost importance that the trials and executions of the criminals, especially those of Courtenay and Elizabeth, should be concluded before the arrival of the prince. The queen evasively replied, that she had neither rest nor sleep for the anxiety she took for the security of his highness at his coming. Gardiner then remarked, that as long as Elizabeth was alive, there was no hope that the kingdom could be tranquil, but if every one went to work as roundly as he did in providing remedies, things would go on better. As touching Courtenay, pursues Renaud, there is matter sufficient against him to make his punishment certain, but for Elizabeth, they had not yet been able to obtain matter sufficient for her conviction, because those persons with whom she was in communication have fled. Nevertheless, her majesty tells me, that from day to day they are finding more proofs against her; that especially they had several witnesses, who deposed as to the preparation of arms and provisions, which she made for the purpose of rebelling with the others and of maintaining herself in strength in a house to which she sent the supplies. This was of course Donnington Castle, to which allusion has so often been made. Renaud then proceeds to relate the substance of a conversation he had had with Paget on the subject of Elizabeth, in which he says, that Paget told him, that if they could not procure sufficient evidence to enable them to put her to death, the best way of disposing of her would be to send her out of the kingdom through the medium of a foreign marriage. And the Prince of Piedmont was named as the most eligible person on whom to bestow her. Great advantages were offered to all parties. Paget considered if this convenient union could be effected, it would obviate all the dangers and difficulties involved in the unpopular marriage between Queen Mary and Philip of Spain, and if Elizabeth could be induced to consent to such an alliance, her own rights in the succession were to be secured to her consort, in the event of the queen having no children, for the minister added, he could see no way by which she could at present be excluded or deprived of the right which the Parliament had given her. If we may rely on Holinshed, whose testimony as a contemporary is at any rate deserving of attention, Elizabeth's table, while she was a prisoner in the Tower, was supplied at her own cost. He gives a curious account of the disputes that took place daily between the authorities of the Tower and the servants of the princess, who were appointed to purvey for her. These, when they brought her daily diet to the outer gate of the Tower, were required to deliver it, says our chronicler, to the common rascal soldiers, and they considering it unmeet that it should pass through such hands, requested the vice-chamberlain Sir John Gage, who had personal charge and control over the royal captive, that they might be permitted to deliver it within the Tower themselves. This he refused, on the plea that the Lady Elizabeth was a prisoner, and should be treated as such, and when they remonstrated with him, he threatened that, if they did either frown or shrug at him, he would set them where they should neither see sun nor moon. Either they or their mistress had the boldness to appeal to the lords of the council, by whom 10 of the princess's own servants were appointed to superintend the purveyances and cooking department, and to serve her at table, namely, 2 yeomen of her chamber, 2 of her robes, 2 of her pantry and ewry, 1 of her buttery, 1 of her cellar, another of her larder, and 2 of her kitchen. At first the chamberlain was much displeased, and continued to annoy them by various means, though he afterwards behaved more courteously, and good cause why, adds the chronicler, for he had good cheer and fared of the best, and her grace paid for it. From a letter of Renaud to the emperor, dated the 7th of April, we find there were high words between Elizabeth's kinsman, the admiral, Lord William Howard, and Sir John Gage, about a letter full of seditious expressions in her favour which had been found in the street. In what manner Lord William Howard identified Sir John Gage with this attempt to ascertain the state of public feeling towards Elizabeth, or whether he suspected it of being a device for accusing her friends, it is difficult to judge, but he passionately told Gage that she would be the cause of cutting off so many heads that both he and others would repent it. On the 13th of April, Wyatt was brought to the block, and on the scaffold publicly retracted all that he had formerly said, in the vain hope of escaping the penalty of his own treason, to criminate Elizabeth and Courtenay. Up to this period the imprisonment of Elizabeth had been so extremely rigorous that she had not been permitted to cross the threshold of her own apartments, and now, her health beginning to give way again, she entreated permission to take a little air and exercise. Lord Chandos, the constable of the Tower, expressed his regret at being compelled to refuse her, as it was contrary to his orders. She then asked leave to walk only in the suite of apartments called the Queen's Lodgings. He applied to the council for instructions, and after some discussion the indulgence was granted, but only on condition that he himself, the Lord Chamberlain, and 3 of the Queen's ladies, who were selected for that purpose, accompanied her, and that she should not be permitted to show herself at the windows, which were ordered to be kept shut. A few days afterwards, as Elizabeth evidently required air as well as exercise, she was allowed to walk in a little garden that was enclosed with high pales, but the other prisoners were strictly enjoined not so much as to look in that direction while her grace remained therein. The powerful interest that was excited for the captive princess at this fearful crisis may be conjectured by the lively sympathy manifested towards her by the children of the officers and servants of the royal fortress, who brought her offerings of flowers. One of these tender-hearted little ones was the child of Martin, the keeper of the queen's robes. Another was called Susanna, a babe not above 3 years old. There was also another infant girl, who having one day found some little keys, carried them to the princess when she was walking in the garden, and innocently told her, she had brought her the keys now, so she need not always stay there, but might unlock the gates and go abroad. Elizabeth was all her life remarkable for her love of children, and her natural affection for them was doubtless greatly increased by the artless traits of generous feeling and sympathy, which she experienced in her time of trouble from her infant partisans in the Tower. How jealous a watch was kept on her and them may be gathered from the following passage in one of Renaud's letters to the Emperor Charles V. It is asserted that Courtenay has sent his regards to the Lady Elizabeth by a child of 5 years old, who is in the Tower, the son of one of the soldiers there. This passage authenticates the pretty incident related in the life of Elizabeth, in Fox's Appendix, where we are told that at the hour she was accustomed to walk in the garden in the Tower, there usually repaired unto her a little boy about 4 years old, the child of one of the people of the Tower, in whose pretty prattling she took great pleasure. He was accustomed to bring her flowers, and to receive at her hands such things as commonly please children, which bred a great suspicion in the chancellor, that by this child letters were exchanged between the Princess Elizabeth and Courtenay, and so thoroughly was the matter sifted, that the innocent little creature was examined by the lords of the council, and plied with alternative promises of rewards if he would tell the truth and confess who sent him to the Lady Elizabeth with letters, and to whom he carried tokens from her, and threats of punishment if he persisted in denying it. Nothing, however, could be extracted from the child, and he was dismissed with threats, and his father, who was severely reprimanded, was enjoined not to suffer his boy to resort any more to her grace, which nevertheless he attempted the next day to do, but finding the door locked, he peeped through a hole, and called to the princess who was walking in the garden. Mistress, I can bring you no more flowers now." The Tower was at that time crowded with prisoners of state, among whom, besides Elizabeth's kinsman and political lover Courtenay, were Sir James Crofts, Sir William St. Lo, Edmund Tremaine, Harrington, and others of her own household, and last, not least, Lord Robert Dudley, who was afterwards her great favourite, the celebrated Earl of Leicester. This nobleman was born on the same day and in the same hour with Elizabeth, and had been one of her playfellows in childhood, having, as he afterwards said, known her intimately from her 8th year. Considering the intriguing temper of both, it is probable that, notwithstanding the jealous precautions of their respective jailers, some sort of secret understanding was established between them even at this period, possibly through the medium of the child, who brought the daily offerings of flowers to the princess, although the timid Courtenay was the person suspected of carrying on a correspondence by the agency of this infant Mercury. The signal favour that Elizabeth lavished on Robert Dudley, by appointing him her master of horse, and loading him with honours within the first week of her accession to the crown, must have originated from some powerful motive which does not appear on the surface of history. His imprisonment in the Tower was for aiding and abetting his ambitious father, the Duke of Northumberland, and his faction, in raising Lady Jane Grey, the wife of his brother, Lord Guildford Dudley, to the throne, to the prejudice of Elizabeth no less than her sister Mary. Therefore he must by some means have succeeded, not only in winning Elizabeth's pardon for this offence, but in exciting an interest in her bosom of no common nature, while they were both imprisoned in the Tower, since being immediately after his liberation employed in the wars in France, he had no other opportunity of ingratiating himself with that princess. On the 17th of April, Noailles writes, "Madame Elizabeth, having since her imprisonment been very closely confined, is now more free. She has the liberty of going all over the Tower, but without daring to speak to any one but those appointed to guard her. As they cannot prove her implication with the recent insurrection, it is thought she will not die." Great agitation pervaded Mary's privy council at this time, according to the reports of Renaud to his imperial master, on the subject of Elizabeth and Courtenay. "What one counsels," says he, "another contradicts. One advises to save Courtenay, another Elizabeth, and such confusion prevails that all we expect is to see their disputes end in war and tumult." He then notices that the Chancellor Gardiner headed one party, and the Earl of Arundel, Pembroke, Sussex, the Master of the Horse, Paget, Petre, and the Admiral another. These were now the protectors of Elizabeth, and Renaud adds, "that the queen is irresolute about what should be done with her and Courtenay, but that he can see that she is inclined to set him at liberty through the intercession of her comptroller, Sir Robert Rochester, and his friends, who have formed a compact for his marriage with that lady. As for Elizabeth," pursues he, "the lawyers can find no matter for her condemnation. Already she has liberty to walk in the Tower garden, and even if they had proof, they would not dare to proceed against her for the love of the admiral her kinsman, who espouses her quarrel, and has at present all the force of England in his power. If, however, they release her, it appears evident that the heretics will proclaim her queen." The part taken by Arundel in favour of Elizabeth was so decided, that the queen was advised to send him to the Tower. Paget appears to have played a double game, first plotting with one side and then with the other, sometimes urging the immediate execution of Elizabeth, and then intriguing with her partisans. In the midst of these agitations, the queen was stricken with a sudden illness, and it must have been at that time that Gardiner, on his own responsibility, sent a privy council warrant to the lieutenant of the Tower for the immediate execution of Elizabeth. He knew the temper of that princess, and probably considered that in the event of the queen's death he had sinned too deeply against her to be forgiven, and therefore ventured a bold stroke to prevent the possibility of the sword of vengeance passing into her hand, by her succeeding to the royal office. Bridges, the honest lieutenant of the Tower, observing the queen's signature was not affixed to this illegal instrument for the destruction of the heiress of the realm, and being sore grieved for the charge it contained, refused to execute it till he had ascertained the queen's pleasure by a direct communication on the subject with her majesty. The delay caused by this caution preserved Elizabeth from the machinations of her foes. The queen was much displeased when she found such a plot was in agitation, and sent Sir Henry Bedingfeld, a stern Norfolk knight, in whose courage and probity she knew she could confide, with 100 of her guard, to take the command of the Tower, till she could form some plan for the removal of her sister to one of the royal residences further from the metropolis. Notwithstanding all that had been done by friends, foes, and designing foreign potentates, to inflame the queen's mind against Elizabeth, the voice of nature was suffered to plead in behalf of the oppressed captive. Early in May it was noticed that her majesty began, when speaking of Elizabeth, to call her sister, which she had not done before since her imprisonment, and that she had caused her portrait to be replaced next to her own in her gallery. She had positively given up the idea of bringing either her or Courtenay to trial for their alleged offences, and had negatived the suspicious proposal of the emperor that Elizabeth should be sent into a sort of honourable banishment to the court of his sister, the Queen of Hungary, or his own court at Brussels. It was then suggested in council that she should be imprisoned in the Pontefract Castle, but that ill-omened place, stained with the blood of princes, was rejected for the royal bowers of Woodstock, where it was finally determined to send her, under the charge of Sir Henry Bedingfeld and Lord Williams of Tame, who were both staunch Catholics. Elizabeth, who naturally regarded every unwonted movement and change with apprehension, when she first saw Sir Henry Bedingfeld and the 100 men-at-arms in blue coats under his command enter the inner court of the Tower, supposing it to be a prelude to her execution, demanded in terror, if the Lady Jane's scaffold were removed? She then sent for Lord Chandos, and fearfully inquired the meaning of what she saw. He endeavoured to calm her mind by telling her that she had no cause for alarm, but that his orders were to consign her into the charge of Sir Henry Bedingfeld, to be conveyed, he believed, to Woodstock. Elizabeth then declared that she knew not what manner of man Bedingfeld was, and inquired whether he were a person who made conscience of murder, if such an order were entrusted to him? Her mind evidently recurred on this occasion to the appointment of Sir James Tyrrell by Richard III. For the midnight murder of the youthful brethren of her grandmother, Elisabeth of York, as a parallel circumstance; and when it is remembered that 70 years had not elapsed since the perpetration of this mysterious tragedy, it is not to be wondered that the stout heart of Elizabeth Tudor occasionally vibrated with a thrill of terror during her incarceration as a state prisoner within those gloomy walls. The 19th of May is generally mentioned as the date of Elizabeth's removal from the Tower. We find this notice in a contemporary record. The 20th day of May, my lady Elizabeth, the queen's sister, came out of the Tower, and took her barge at the Tower wharf, and so to Richmond. Elizabeth was attended on this occasion by the Lord Treasurer, Marquis of Winchester, and the Chamberlain. She performed the voyage to Richmond without once landing, till she arrived there. It is affirmed that she was then conducted to the palace, where she had an interview with the queen, her sister, who offered her pardon and liberty, on condition of her accepting the hand of Philibert of Savoy, Prince of Piedmont, in marriage, and that she firmly refused to contract matrimony with him or any other foreign prince whatsoever, alleging her preference of a single life. The harsh measures that were adopted that evening at Richmond, in removing all her own servants from their attendance on her person, were probably resorted to on account of the inflexibility of her determination on this point. She evidently considered herself in great peril, for she required the prayers of her departing servants with mournful earnestness. "For this night," said she, "I think I must die." Which sorrowful words drew fountains of tears from their eyes, and her gentlemen ushers went to the Lord Tame in the court, and conjured him to tell him whether the princess his mistress were in danger of death that night, that if so, he and his fellows might take such part as God would appoint. "Marry, God forbid!" exclaimed Lord Tame. that any such wickedness should be intended, which rather than it should be wrought, I and my men will die at her feet." All night, however, a strict guard of soldiers kept watch and ward about the house where she lay to prevent escape or rescue. The next morning, in crossing the river at Richmond to proceed on her melancholy journey towards Woodstock, she found her disbanded servants lingering on the banks of the Thames to take a last look of her. "Go to them," said she to one of the gentlemen in her escort, "and tell them from me, tanquam ovis, like a sheep to the slaughter, for so," added she, "am I led." No one was, however, permitted to have access to her, and the most rigorous scrutiny was used towards every one who endeavoured to open the slightest communication, either direct or indirect, with the royal captive. Noailles, the French ambassador, no sooner understood that Elizabeth was removed from the Tower, than he commenced his old tricks, by sending a spy with a present of apples to her on her journey. A very unwelcome mark of attention from such a quarter, considering the troubles and dangers in which the unfortunate girl had already been involved, in consequence of that unprincipled diplomat's previous intercourse with her and her household. The guards, as a matter of course, stopped and examined the messenger, whom they stripped to the shirt, but found nothing except the apples, which from the season of the year might appear an acceptable offering, but certainly an ill-judged one under the present circumstances, and doubtless it had an unfavourable effect on the mind of Elizabeth's stern guardian, Sir Henry Bedingfeld. The sympathy of the people for the distressed heiress of the realm was manifested by their assembling to meet her by the way, and greeting her with tearful prayers and loving words. But when they pressed nearer to obtain a sight of her, they were driven back, and angrily reviled by the names of rebels and traitors to the queen. And whereas, pursues the chronicler, in certain villages the bells were rung for joy for her supposed deliverance as she passed, Sir Henry Bedingfeld took the matter so distastefully that he commanded the bells to be stopped, and set the ringers in the stocks. The second day's journey brought Elizabeth to Windsor, where she spent the night, and lodged in the dean's house near St. George's Chapel. The next resting place was Rycote, in Oxfordshire, which being the seat of Lord Williams of Tame, she there received every princely and hospitable entertainment from that amiable nobleman, who had invited a noble company of knights and ladies to meet his royal charge at dinner, and treated her with all the marks of respect that were due to her exalted rank as the sister of his sovereign. This seasonable kindness greatly revived the drooping spirits of the princess, though it was considered rather de trop by Sir Richard Bedingfeld, who significantly asked his fellow commissioner if he were aware of the consequences of thus entertaining the queen's prisoner. The generous Williams replied, with manly spirit, that let what would befall, her grace might and should be merry in his house. It is said, that when Elizabeth expressed a wish to Sir Henry Bedingfeld to delay her departure till she had seen a game of chess, in which Lord Williams and another gentleman were engaged, played out, he would not permit it. Probably Sir Henry suspected that she intended to outwit him by means of a secret understanding between the friendly antagonists in order to gain time, for it is well known that a game of chess may be prolonged for days, and in fact to any length of time. It is also related that as they were proceeding towards Woodstock, a violent storm of wind and rain, which they encountered, greatly disordered the princess's dress, insomuch that her hood and veil were twice or thrice blown off, on which she begged to retire to a gentleman's house near the road. This, we are told, Sir Henry Bedingfeld, who, perhaps, had some reason for his caution, would not permit, and it is added that the royal prisoner was fain to retire behind the shelter of a hedge by the wayside to replace her headgear and bind up her disordered tresses. Section 7.